Good afternoon. Anna, the screen is still gray. I'm wondering if I should, oh, there we go. Perfect. There you go. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to MITA's March program, Intercultural Understanding, Keeping Your Message, Meetings, and Meeting on Track. My name is Maria Cartier. I am the Market Development Manager at Port Milwaukee and one of your MITA board members. Next slide. We have a few housekeeping items for today. Please keep in mind, put your microphones on mute unless you're selected for a question or comment. We also recommend turning off your cameras during the speaker presentations. However, would like them on during the Q&A discussion. We will have, after our presenters, we'll have a Q&A session. If you want to post any questions, feel free to do so in the chat. You can send it to everyone, or you can send it privately to Mark Rodahage, our program champion, or Anna Garich, our host today. And want to let everyone know we are recording this event, and it will be available to members after today's session. And as a reminder, we do have our giveaways of two of the Cultural Compass cultural assessments from the Hofstede Insights, and we will be randomly selecting two winners, and we'll announce that during our closing session. So following the welcome and sponsor remarks, we will have our speakers, Mr. David Weber, Program Manager and New Product Integration with Electronics for Imaging, and Jessica Rathke, Associate Partner, Hofstede Insights and Bridge Cultural Consultants. And then following that, we'll have Q&A and then a few closing remarks. We would like to take a moment to recognize our sponsors. Our platinum sponsors, MITA & Company, Trek, and the Geo Group. You can find out more details of all of our sponsors on our website, so feel free to go learn more about those organizations there. I want to remind everyone that April's event is now available for registration, maximizing profits and cash flow in an international economy. And all the event details and opportunity to register can be located on mitatrade.org on our website. And next slide. The next slide, that's okay, is today's sponsor, which is the Geo Group. We're extremely grateful to the Geo Group for organizing today's event. And we are going to have Carla Kucha, who is the regional manager with the Geo Group and a fellow MITA board member, give us a few remarks. Carla?
Thanks, Maria. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. As Maria said, my name is Carla Kuchi, and I am the regional manager of the Geo Group. We are a Star 7 USA company. I'm also on the board of directors for MITA, working on the membership committee. So if you're not already a member, I'll put in a shameless plug right now. Consider joining MITA. You'll get to attend more programs like today's event, along with many other benefits. So back to the Geo Group. The Geo Group is a full-service translation agency and language services provider. We chose to sponsor today's event because we feel this topic is imperative to doing business in today's global marketplace. At the Geo Group, we help businesses with translation of all types of documents, manuals, websites, and marketing materials, videos, e-learning programs, just to name a few. We also provide multilingual voiceover for videos and e-learning programs. And we also provide language and cultural training to help companies take their employees and their global business to another level. I really hope you enjoyed today's program. And if your company requires any language services, I hope you'll consider the Geo Group. And now I will turn it over to Mark Rodahage.
Oh, thanks, Carla, and welcome to everyone. So my name is Mark Rodahage, Director for the Export and Business Development Bureau here at the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. As you can see, the Thank a Farmer sign behind me. And it also says program champion, an appropriate term, actually, because I've been a champion for this program for a while. It's beyond what we may have heard in other presentations around intercultural differences, a lot around the superficial things. And today we'll delve a bit deeper into the drivers. Not only what people do from different cultures, but why they do them and what's driving them. I've come across Hofstede writing more than 15 years ago, and thought that this is an excellent topic, and glad that we're able at this point to bring this to everybody assembled here. So the way the meeting will flow this time, actually the industry practitioner, David Weber, will kick it off. He'll provide us 20 minutes or so of his experiences in Asia. And then Jessica Rathke will speak about as I mentioned, the drivers from Hofstede Insights, and especially those key elements, those key drivers that we come across most often in business. I'll spend a minute here just to introduce both of our speakers to give you a bit of background. David Weber is a program manager for new product integration with electronics for imaging, EFI. He facilitates transferring manufacturing intellectual property to partners in China and Italy, responsible for new product development with a key Japanese supplier, and is involved in managing new product integration in the US and China. David's previous experience includes 4 years as a production manager and new product integration lead at Motawi Tile Works, and 4 years with the Kohler Company as production manager and new product integration lead. David's interest in cultural diversity began when he was stationed in Philippines while serving in the U.S. Navy. He's a graduate of the UW-Wisconsin lacrosse and has spent time in Europe, Japan, and South Korea. In Japan, spent more than a year with a master potter doing fine art pottery work, so an interesting background. He's a lifelong athlete and has raced in 12 Ironman triathlons. So he'll have the stamina, no doubt, for this presentation. Jessica Rathke, my slide down, has 30 years of global translation and localization, sales and marketing experience. She's currently a principal at Fluent Sales, a London, UK and Austin, Texas based consultancy that helps translation industry leaders around the world increase revenue through her training and consulting services. She also helps business leaders improve intercultural leadership competencies through her work with us as associate partner at Hofstede Insights and international initiatives, including projects with the Massachusetts Office of International Trade. That would be our counterparts at WEDC and the International Agribusiness Center here, and the Investment and Massachusetts Port Authority. Jessica holds an MBA and a Bachelor's of Arts in Foreign Affairs and in German from Miami University in Ohio, USA, and has completed postgraduate German studies at the University of Salzburg. Jessica has also been recognized as a translation industry influencer for the past several years. So as you can see, we've got a experienced and insightful pair of presenters here that will begin. David, if you wouldn't mind, take it away with your experiences in Asia.
Thanks, Mark. Share my screen here. Great. Thanks. So today I'd like to just talk a little bit about my experience with managing some international projects in China and Japan in particular. And in my stories, I'll describe how I use kind of a rudimentary understanding of Japanese and Chinese culture to solve some business bottlenecks and communication breakdowns. So I'm hoping that after my little presentation here, you'll have some new ideas on ways to approach the hard to solve problems with communication. So like Mark said, so my experience in international affairs started when I was 17 years old in the US Navy. I lived in the Philippines, and one of my collateral duty jobs was I had to work with a Filipino woodworker. So he was about a 70-year-old man and would carve these intricate foo dogs and dragons into wood with literally a nail that was hammered flat. And I remember one morning sitting out in the wood shop with Sarge, his name is Sarge, and thinking, wow, this guy is just like everybody else. And I grew up in Madison and lived out in Cottage Grove, so there wasn't much cultural diversity, and it was a really an awakening experience for me. And from that point on, I've always been interested in cultures around the world and Asian culture in particular. And this particular picture is of a security guard that when I go to one of the distributors that we use in China, I always stop at the security gate outside the office and say hi to this older gentleman. He's a security guard. I've been seeing him for about 5 years prior to COVID. And every time I go, he greets me and talks to me as if I understand every single word he's saying. And he has the same big smile. So it's a lot of fun. So my approach to solving business problems is to kind of look at the people and the culture first, and then the business side of it second. Let me see if I can move this quick. So the first story I'd like to talk about is it involves Japan. So after I graduated college, I lived in Japan for a year, and I studied pottery with a Japanese master potter. So I lived up in the mountains of the southern Nagano Alps. And we lived in a small rice village. So the house was literally heated with a wood burning stove. And while I lived there, I began to understand sort of a pattern with, although my Japanese, I could speak a little bit of Japanese, I would say that I had more phrases memorized than actually being able to speak it. But I noticed that there was a pattern with the way that they talked. And one particular pattern was that they always apologized, right? So when they would start talking, they'd say, sumimasen. And so what I realized at that point was that there was a unique way that the Japanese approached language and other things. So fast forward a few years later, and I'm working at Electronics for Imaging, and we have to work with a Japanese supplier there. So we're developing a new product. We need their electronics component to work with our component. And the only way we're going to be able to solve this problem is if we can actually collaborate, because there's a lot of intellectual property involved. And so it's a really sensitive issue. So I was assigned to work on the project, and I went to one of the directors who had been working on the project, and he said that the Japanese company wasn't responding to his emails and that we couldn't get any sort of communication going. And so the first thing that I did is I realized that, all right, let's just start over. I want to have a face-to-face conversation with this with this Japanese group. And so what I did is I decided that I would write a letter to email to the Japanese company, but I would format it in a way that the Japanese language is spoken. So for example, start out, by saying the hello, in Japanese, the konnichiwa, very simple. But then the next thing I did is they always seem to apologize. So they're sumimasen. So they're saying, excuse me, I'm sorry for bothering you. And then expressing some sort of gratification or gratitude for taking time to read the email. And then offering to assist them. I'm sorry. And then finally to ask them the actual question that I had for them, which was that I wanted to collaborate with their group, or we needed to collaborate with them. And then telling them that we're looking forward to the collaboration, and then thanking them for the letter. And ironically, what this did is it actually got a response from the Japanese company. So they immediately emailed back and said, yeah, that would be great. Let's get together and talk about this. The next thing that I realized, or that I had experienced when I was in Japan, was that they always follow an agenda, or they love following systems and agendas. And while I was living in Japan, one of the things that I did was I taught conversation English on the side just to make a little bit extra money while I was living there. And one of the places that I would go was a retirement home. And the people at the retirement home would take these day trips. And every time they take a day trip, they'd spend about a week or two creating an agenda. And they create this agenda that was just minute by minute. What would they do throughout the day? And this was just for a one-day trip. And it was almost comical because they would even write down what snacks they would have, what time they give out the snacks, what songs they would sing. So the entire trip, the day trip to the state park or wherever we were going, was scripted out in advance. So I thought, okay, let's approach that with this Japanese company as well. So I sent them an email and I said, hey, let's create an agenda together. And these are the questions that we would like to ask. Please ask us any questions you want. So over the next 2 months, we spent time creating an agenda together so that by the time the meeting actually came around, when we went there, we already knew which questions we were going to ask them. They knew what questions, or we both knew which questions we were going to ask, and we also had time to answer them so that in the event that they needed help translating or we would need help translating, we had plenty of time to work out the details. And so, so that was the next thing we did. We created this agenda, which was great. When I was living in Japan and living with this master potter, the next thing that I noticed that was really unique and interesting in their culture was that they always would give gifts, ugenami. So these gifts, the master potter that I worked with, when he would have a show, after he had his pottery show and would sell the work, the people who bought the pottery would come to a studio and have him sign a handmade wooden box that had the piece of pottery in it. And every time they came, they always gave a gift. And I started noticing that the Japanese people, wherever I went, would give these gifts. And so I thought, okay, we're going to be meeting these Japanese vendors. We've got to make a good impression. Let's give them a gift. So, and we wanted it to be something that was significant. So we gave them these Detroit Tigers baseball caps, and they absolutely loved it. And so that was another way that we brought in, the Japanese culture into this. And so when we were sitting around the table in Japan, everybody from the VPs all the way down to the lab techs that would come in that we were interacting with, we were giving them baseball caps. And it was a lot of fun, and they really enjoyed that. The next part about the Japanese culture that I picked up while I was living there was that they really enjoy their seasonal holidays. So for example, the Cherry Blossom Festival and the Apple Festival and the Fire Festival. And the particular vendor that we were working with, they had a kind of like a Zen garden outside their factory or their office. And the first time I visited there, I noticed that they had cherry trees, and I said, oh, well, the next time I come here, I'd really like to come when the cherry blossoms are in full bloom. And so we set up my next trip so that I could come just to take photos of the view of the outside of their factory or their office with these beautiful cherry blossoms. And that was something else that that I realized about the Japanese culture is that they really enjoy their culture. And so anytime that you can show any sort of appreciation towards Japanese culture, that's something that goes a long way. And then I guess the last part about the Japan experience was inviting them to come to the US as well. So having a ongoing relationship with a Japanese vendor, if you can have, when we have our face-to-face meetings, and now with COVID, we really can't, but we touch base every couple of months via WebEx. And one thing that does just help to solidify and just keep our relationship moving forward. All right. The next story I'd like to tell you about is in China. So the situation that I was faced with in China was I was sent to China because we were trying to launch a new product and it had been failing for over a year. And we weren't sure why, because we had already launched this product in Europe, in the US, in South America, but we couldn't get it to go in China. There was something going on in China. So I flew to China and was traveling around with one of my Chinese colleagues from factory to factory, just trying to figure out what was going on. And during one of the flights, when I asked him, he said, "It's like we're on an island. No one is helping us. No one is telling us what to do." And I started realizing that there's sort of a pattern with the way that within China that they wanted a plan and they wanted to be heard. Like again and again, I kept hearing that over the next couple of weeks or days when I was there, that they just wanted to be told, they needed a plan on what they needed to do and then to be told or helped when they asked a question. So I realized that communication was really going to be key with this. So what we did is we set up a weekly meeting with the teams from China as well as the US. And along with that, I was flying to China about once every 4 to 5 months. And so I was getting to know them face to face, but then we were having these ongoing conversations. And during these conversations, I noticed that there was a bit of a disconnect, because when I was sitting at dinner or at lunch with my Chinese colleagues, depending on whether or not they were more executives or down to the field service engineers, people I was going to the factory sites with, they were very quiet. They wouldn't speak up, and I couldn't understand why. Because at dinner we could talk and they would express their concerns and feelings, but during the meetings, whenever I'd ask a question, nobody would say anything, and I didn't understand really what was going on. And one of the colleagues, James, a field service engineer, he had this saying. I asked him why the Chinese people, he and his colleagues weren't really saying very much, and he always had this saying. He said, if you don't cause a problem, you won't have a problem. And so I just sensed that there was this fear to just expressing verbally, if there was any sort of problem. And so one thing that I started to do was when I would ask a specific question, I would wait 4 seconds and just give them time to talk. And it was really interesting because after about 3 seconds of silence, they would start to talk, and we were able to really start opening up the communication. But I realized that one of the things that was a problem was, so in China, or at least with the companies that I've worked with, the upper management, the owners, are very stern, and it's a really hard, it's really difficult to get past that barrier of rank. And so for James, the field service engineer, he's the one who knew the answers or the problems that we're having at these customer sites, I had to get James to talk. And it was really difficult because he was so afraid of his upper management that he wouldn't voice his opinion. And so one of the things that I did was I started to get to know the owners of the business, and I'd play ping pong with them at lunchtime. And so I was trying to set up this relationship with the owners and also the field service engineers and everybody in between, that that it's okay for us to talk and to have an open dialogue with what we were doing. Because there was definitely a sense that they were just supposed to keep their mouth shut and just be told, or just do what they're told to do. But in order to make the situation work, we really had to get the answers from James and all of the field service engineers, because this wasn't a problem that we could solve at 30,000 feet in an executive boardroom. This was a problem that had to be solved down in the factory, where you're checking the intricate details of the machinery. And so by just loosening up a little bit, we're able to, and having the meetings so that they're free flowing and laughing and getting to know each other, we actually got the conversation to start flowing. Which led to the next project that I had in China, which was related to this group. We had to transfer some intellectual property for manufacturing over to China. And what we did for this project was we applied everything that we had learned, with our initial product launch, with this next one. And so, well, what I found that worked for us was by having the regular communication. So we have our regular weekly meeting where it's a free-flowing conversation. All the new Chinese colleagues that get invited in, I make sure that that they understand that it's okay to talk, that it's okay to express any questions or concerns that they have. When I ask questions, I give them time to answer, because for some reason, there's a bit of a pause or delay with when they feel comfortable speaking. The next thing that we do is during these meetings, we follow a very specific agenda. So we always list out the agenda in advance so that they can see what the questions will be. They know that we're following up on the actual problems that they're having. And during the meeting, because often the communication with just being able to speak both languages, what we do is we'll present a topic verbally during the WebEx, but then we'll actually hash out the details via email. So if one of my Chinese colleagues says or presents a problem, I'll say, oh, okay, thank you for presenting that. could you send an email describing exactly what the problem is and include any pictures, photographs, videos, anything that you have, or spreadsheet data? And so what we found is that we can solve our problems. We've come up with a communication flow to transfer intellectual or technical information very fluidly, via email rather than trying to answer each other's questions over the call. And what the WebEx ends up being for us more is just a way to reinforce our relationship and our bond, and actually friendship too, because over the years we've gotten to know each other quite a bit better that way. Let's see. So the thing that I found that helps quite a bit is just focusing on getting to know the people first, and then looking at the business side of it kind of second, because in the end, it's just, they're people just like us. And so I found that helps quite a bit. So that concludes my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great, David. Really appreciate that, and never underestimate the unifying power of donuts, as I saw on your last slide. So that was excellent. And so what we'd like to do is now bring on Jessica Rathke. So as David talked about some of the experiences, Jessica will share then some of what those, as we mentioned before, the driver elements, those key things, and maybe to help reveal some of the reasons why people do things the way that they do. So with that, Jessica, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, great. Can you hear me, and see my slides? Just double checking here.
So good. Yes, I didn't know if you could see me or not.
Excellent. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. It's just great. It's a topic I absolutely love, and I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to cover quite a bit in the next few minutes. And I'm hoping actually that I'll be able to relate this back to some of the previous presentation. I took a few little notes here so that I can kind of pull some of that together as well. So without further ado, we have a bit to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and make a start. So we start with a fish. And this is an old Arabic proverb. We don't know who discovered the sea, but we're sure it wasn't a fish. And so this is kind of my entree into the whole idea of culture, because we kind of are like that, or we could even think of ourselves as being in a fish bowl in the United States, for example. We're in our US culture, and I don't know, when we grow up and we're in it and we live it, we don't really think about it very much. It just is. All the assumptions, all the kind of filters we use to make sense of the world are fairly similar. Yes, they're kind of outliers and what have you, but we kind of view the world the same way. And then when we maybe jump from our fishbowl into another fishbowl, suddenly things don't work the same way. And the way people behave, is different. It can be puzzling, frustrating, exciting, strange, all sorts of things. So I wanted to start with this because I think it kind of sets the stage in a very nice way. And I kind of mentioned before this cultural filter. So we all have a cultural filter in terms of how we view our own culture and also how we view other cultures. And so I like having a little bit of fun with this, but I'm just curious to hear what you have to say about this, or at least answer it yourselves and see if you can guess who we're talking about. So if we look at this culture from the Japanese point of view, it's relaxed. They're friendly, they're spontaneous, uninhibited people, emotional, and, well, a bit impulsive. And then we have the Mexicans, and they say this culture is always in a hurry, serious, reserved, restrained even, composed, and methodical. So, quite different perspectives because of this cultural filter. So I'm wondering if you guys guessed perhaps they're talking about Americans, because that's who they're talking about. So, this kind of gives you a little bit of perspective in terms of, how we might be viewing, we have a view of Japanese people, we have a view of Mexican people, and they have a view of us as well. And, it wasn't really until I lived overseas when I was studying in Austria that I got a real good sense of what people thought of Americans. And it wasn't necessarily all bad, but there were a few things that were pointed out to me that I had never thought of before. So it does give one perspective, but it also can, kind of create some misunderstandings and miscommunications along the way. So that's what we're going to kind of pull apart here today. So I'd like to start kind of the more serious part of this presentation by kind of referring to the discoverer of the Hofstede model of culture. It's called the model of six dimensions of culture. And I think we should start by defining, at least according to Dr. Hofstede, what culture is, which is the collective programming of the human mind, which distinguishes the members of one group or society from those of another. And I think it's important to just give you a tiny bit of background about Dr. Hofstede because he was quite a pioneer. And he is, I think Hofstede's work in the realms of cross-cultural studies is one of the most quoted resources for cross-cultural understanding. And it's based on his research that he conducted when he was with IBM Corporation, gosh, a long time ago, back in the 1960s. And he created, from that research, and it was internal people at IBM, but again, across 40 countries. And from that, he created the first 4 dimensions of the Hofstede model. So you'll see more about that in a minute. I think it's also important to understand that the model has been revalidated about 20 times or so. And cultures do change a little bit, but the relative distance or differences between cultures in relation to one another pretty much remain constant over time. So I did want to mention that before we kind of dig into the different dimensions of culture. I also kind of want to put the idea of culture in a slightly different context. So, when we talk about this programming of the human mind, we're thinking in terms of where does this cultural aspect lie? Well, it's sort of in between two things, which is, our basic selves. I mean, because we're human, we have all kinds of things in common. Biologically, certainly, a lot of that's it is universal, and it's pretty much inherited. We get what we get. The next level up would be culture. So this is that learned behavior. It's specific to different groups of people. So we can kind of think of that as a forest. So thinking of a particular culture, you could think of it as country, as a forest. And then we have, individuals here who make up the forest, who have their own personalities, very individual types of behaviors, some of which is inherited and some of which is learned. And this is an important thing to keep in mind as we go through the dimensions, because they're going to be outliers of individuals. So when we start looking at these so-called scores of cultures, we have to recognize that this is sort of the law of averages and trends and general behavior and expected behavior within a culture. But there are always going to be outliers, just like in any country or culture, but they are still part of the forest. So let's take a look at those 6 dimensions of Hofstede's model. So the first one, and probably the most influential in a way, is what's called the PDI, or Power Distance Index, which is a culture's relationship or people's relationship to power. So it's how much power is the differential between, say, a leader and his subjects or the general population. How much power do we have as individuals versus other people? There's individuals, excuse me, I'm talking too fast. Individualism versus collectivism, which I think we can all pretty much relate to, but that's our relationship to the group. So we as Americans are the most individualistic culture in the world. And it's all, it's all about the individual. It's about me and maybe our family, but it isn't necessarily about a group of people. So in countries, for example, China would be a good example of that. And we talked a little bit about that already in the previous presentation. Masculinity versus femininity. This is kind of the relationship to motivation. It's kind of, I guess the best way I could relate it is groups of people who work in order to live, and then other groups of people or cultures who live in order to work. So it's sort of success or, orientation, as opposed to sort of relationship orientation, kind of. There's a little controversy about the naming of this, but we haven't come up with anything better at Hofstede, so it's left as masculine and feminine. The next one is uncertainty avoidance. So this is our relationship to uncertainty. So are we comfortable with uncertainty, or does that make us really uncomfortable? And we're going to investigate that one in particular in more depth. Then we have long-term orientation, so relationship to time. So again, I'll use Americans as a quick example. We're kind of short-term oriented as opposed to, say, the Japanese, who are much more long-term oriented people. So it's that relationship to time, and then indulgence versus restraint. So do we prolong, do we wait for pleasure, or do we kind of indulge in it? We don't have time to go through all of this, so I've chosen 3 of these. So we're going to take in a more in-depth look at power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and then we're going to take a quick look at uncertainty avoidance. And I've got lots of examples in here in terms of different countries that fit into these different categories. And yeah, let's start taking a look. So the first model of culture is power distance, the extent to which your society accepts that power is distributed equally or not. So of course, in the US, we like to think of things as being more equal. In other countries, it's not necessarily that way. I also have a couple of really, I think, I just love these examples. My apologies here. Let's fix that. So here we have a really good example of lower power distance, where we have the Dutch Prime Minister riding his bicycle and parking it outside in front of the King's Palace to form a government. So, this guy isn't coming up in a limousine, and, he's not making any airs about it. In fact, he's putting a lock on his bicycle as well, which I find I just think that's so cool. And then we have a different picture from Thailand, where, we have royalty. We have people obviously being very deferential to a leader. So that would be a much higher power distance culture. So let's take a look at this in more specifics using some examples. And before we get into some of the detail here, I would like to explain that the numbers, it is the Hofstede model has a scale of 100 in which they kind of score countries, and this is based on Hofstede's research and all the validations. So each country is assigned a particular score. The scores are kind of important, but what's more important is how they relate to one another and what's that differential. So if we look at Denmark here, it has a very low power distance score of 18. And way off here to the right, we have Russia, which scores a 93. That's a pretty big differential. So it helps us kind of look at things like, ooh, you know, this is something to pay attention to. Whereas, you know, the difference between the US and Spain, for example, isn't so huge. It's a little, there is a fair difference, but it's not going to be quite as distant, I guess, to use that word, between Denmark and Russia. So let's just take a look at some of the aspects of what lower power distance can mean versus high. So of course, we've already kind of indicated this, or I have, that inequality is quite different. You know, it's minimized in these cultures here. So Ireland, UK, Germany, France, US, and it's pretty well accepted in countries like Russia, China, a bit so in Poland and also Spain. So in a business context, employees would expect to be consulted. You can kind of contradict or question your manager. Maybe not all the time, but you know, it's certainly something that I would be comfortable doing. Whereas, you know, it's more, you know, directive. So employees obey the power holder, rarely contradict their manager. Leaders on our side of the fence, so to speak, are more accessible and really not too are pretty inaccessible. So if we go back to those pictures, I think the guy in Denmark, we could probably, you know, question, challenge, you know, walk up and have a conversation, whereas I think the other person probably not. Control is definitely disliked, and control is really pretty much expected. So looking at, you know, kind of what can we do to adapt to countries that have much higher power distance than we do, say, in the United States. I'm going to focus, and on all these slides, I'm going to focus on the things that we can do to adapt our behavior. And I've got this here that you can read, but I'm going to focus on this left-hand side so that we can kind of cover a few more dimensions so you get a broader view of everything. But, and this kind of relates to the previous presenter in terms of some of the things that he said in terms of giving kind of clear instructions and planning and telling and helping people understand, so that they're confident in what they're going to do. So very clear instructions, showing interest in their work, the work that they're doing that's been completed, especially if it's been well done, and being visible to employees. So being very present, where I think, you know, because they won't just come to us to challenge a question, we need to be there asking to be sure that you know, what needs to be done does get done. And I can say this for my work at Abridge Consulting. I help, I'm actually managing a sales team of Chinese folks. And I can tell you, I didn't do this at first, and it was a disaster. Even though I know it, I'm so habituated, and, you know, my American cultural filter just got in the way of me getting what I wanted from the team. And they were probably sitting there going, when is she going to tell us what we're supposed to be doing so that we know what our direction is? I think looking at from like a sales and marketing point of view, then authority figures can be really important, you know, for endorsements of your product, any kind of official certifications, you know, emphasize how you create benefits for like a whole company or a whole population, not just the individual. And status symbols can also be quite useful. So that's kind of the summary of kind of looking at things from a low power distance point of view and dealing with high power distance. So if we look at individualism, so we compare that with collectivism, so the degree to which people feel comfortable to be part of a group, which is supposed to take care of them. So the group takes care of people in exchange for the loyalty to the group. So that's quite different from us as a very individualistic society where we look after ourselves and our immediate family and maybe really close friends, but that's pretty much as far as it goes. We're not expected to take care of a big, wide group of people. So again, same flags rearranged. quite different here. So if we kind of look at the low individualistic societies, we have China, very low individualism, and Russia being not so individualistic either. And of course, I've mentioned the US, very high. Great Britain, where I happen to be sitting right now, I'm in London. We're very close together that way. Same for France. And then, you know, the rest of the countries are maybe a bit more towards the middle. But it kind of makes sense to me, I would say, in my experience with all of these folks and these folks, it rings true. So collectivists, there's the we consciousness versus the I consciousness. There's relationship before business. So the previous presentation was talking about this too. You know, we had the picture of him playing ping pong with some of the guys, and it really is important to build the relationship before you could ever really think about asking people to do business with you from a low individualistic culture. And so, you know, the sales cycles and all of that would be much, much longer. And, you know, it just takes time. Whereas, you know, where we come from, it's kind of, hey, let's do some business. And if you do well, then we can build a relationship. So it's almost kind of the antithesis in a way. Yeah, the trust is built on mutual, you know, I have your back, you have my back, we have each other's backs. Whereas for us, I think trust tends to be based on performance and the results that we achieve. Harmony versus freedom. Implicit communication, which we'll get into a little bit deeper, but you know, there's a lot of reading between the lines, particularly in Asian cultures, I've found, at least with my Chinese colleagues. Whereas we just, you know, we say what we mean. We're pretty explicit in our neck of the woods. And again, a loss of face, you know, something is done wrong. If somebody does something wrong, it can impact the group. So there's this aspect of shame, which is why I think a lot of times, you know, people don't step out and forward because, as he said, you know, it's not, you know, why would I bring problems upon myself or my group? And for us, it's more on the guilt side of things. And then there are different rules if you're inside the group than there are for people outside. Whereas for us, the rules apply pretty much to everybody. So, quick way to think about collectivist cultures is there's a pretty hard shell on the outside, but once you get in the middle, you get everything. Whereas for us, it's kind of like, yeah, kind of easy to bite into, pretty nice, get to know people. You know, it's pretty soft, but then there's this core in the middle that's very, very, very difficult to penetrate. So what do we do to adapt? Again, I'm going to focus on the high individualistic countries, since that's my audience for the most part today, to adapt to low individualism. So, you know, expecting more subtle and implicit communication. So sort of what they say is reading the air. There's a lot that just doesn't need to be said in cultures that have each other's back. You know, they all have, you know, sort of an understanding, which, you know, we would be outside of. Criticizing in public, definitely not. So if I have, like with my sales team, if there's a problem, it's always dealt with on a one-on-one basis, never in front of other people. Investing energy to find out what goes wrong. So when nobody was replying to my emails or answering my vague questions, I had to go ask, like, what do you need from me? Why didn't you answer my email? And it was, the discomfort was unbelievable, but I got the message. Investing in that relationship development and then managing it really, really well. And again, emphasizing how your product or service benefits the group or the community that you serve or are selling to. Yeah, I think that's it for that. One more dimension. I hope yeah. So the last one is uncertainty avoidance. So the extent to which people feel threatened by uncertainty and ambiguity and try to avoid such situations. This, I think, kind of says it all. You don't have to read German, which this is, to understand that There's a lot of information here on a toothbrush and on toothpaste. And there are diagrams and lists of ingredients and showing how it's done and how it works. And it's endorsed by expert professor, doctor, somebody or another. You know, and people read this and they want to know this because they, yeah, it's a simple example of risk aversion, but I think it's a really good one. And then here in the US, it's like, you're going to have a beautiful smile. It's the results. It's, you know, it tastes good and, you know, it's going to change the way you think about toothpaste, you know, and a few little details, but, you know, the emphasis is totally different. So I think, and it's recommended by most dentists, so that's not so specific. They want specifics over here. So again, same flags moving around again. So low uncertainty avoidance. Scandinavian countries tend to be okay with uncertainty. And I don't know if any of you have ever negotiated a contract or done business with Scandinavians, but I've negotiated the Hofstede contract. It's out of Finland. And boy, did we discuss it a lot. And, you know, there was just you know, I think it took us about 6 months to get the contract done. And I mean, even though the US is pretty, you know, okay with uncertainty, it really bothered me that I was working for a company that wanted a contract, yet we didn't have a contract because we were still talking about it. I think over here it makes a lot of sense. Uncertainty avoidance is I think fairly common knowledge. Russia, again, very uncertainty avoidant. Poland as well. Spain, Germany, etc. So I've got to get going here so that we can kind of get towards the end of the presentation. So risk tolerance, we don't need so many rules, lots of rules over here. We work hard if we need to or want to. Here it's kind of the urge because risk is reduced if we work harder. It's also reduced if people see we're working harder. Dissent is okay. We don't really want to be disagreeing too much over here. Emotions, we tend not to show them, whereas it's very interesting on risk avoidant cultures, emotions shown. I mean, I've seen people fight. I've seen people yell at each other. On the other side of the fence, there's a lot of hugging, which I've experienced in all of these markets, actually less hugging in Germany, but certainly in Spain, Poland, and Russia. Stress and anxiety, not so much. And again, higher stress. So kind of, again, can be quite opposite. Okay, so how do we adapt? So from our point of view, from the US point of view, to very highly risk averse cultures, detailed and structured plans. So again, that was kind of mentioned earlier today. And, you know, structure and detail is important, and it reduces that risk on their side. Creating predictability to assure or reassure your counterpart. So, you know, don't go shifting all over the place. Don't change your plans, especially like if you've submitted a proposal, trying to change that or trying to modify a contract would be very difficult, I think. Demonstrating expertise also wins that trust and confidence, and minimizes risk. Decision-making will take time. Yeah, a lot of everything should just, you know, just like that German advertisement for a toothbrush and toothpaste, all the characteristics should be spelled out, and probably even more so for even more risk averse or uncertainty avoidant countries. Product specifications and just the competencies, you know, not so much on the results, but, you know, that there's competence and there's assuredness in making that decision to use that product or service. And then this is actually my last slide. I'm going to let it sit there for a second. I just really find this kind of funny. It's very humorous. If you look at the different cultures. So, you know, Germany, they want to solve it, and they want to solve it thoroughly and quickly. US, we're going to tech it a bit. Britain, we're going to have tea. In Ireland, this is very stereotypical. We're going to drink beer, I guess, or Guinness. Yeah, I just give you a chance to look at these and maybe you see some cultures that you're familiar with. I hope that this has given you at least, you know, it's kind of a high level overview of the dimensions of culture, but hopefully it gives you some thoughts and ideas about maybe dealing with some of your counterparts. And I think I'm done. I'm going to hand it back over to our organizers. And if you want my slides or anything, please let me know and I'll be happy to get them to you. So
Very good. Thanks, Jessica and David. Great examples, excellent information. And a few questions have come through in chat. So I'll kind of go through those. And then as we're talking about the questions just for the group, this is really questions, answers, and comments. So certainly most of us, if not all of us, have a fair bit of experience in overseas and probably some experiences of our own that either we can illuminate some of these points or say, you know, I've been confused about this for a long time. Maybe you can help us to sort it out. So as we're talking through a couple of the questions that came through chat, to be thinking about that, and then we'll talk through the answers. So the first one is coming out of from CW. Let me just scroll up to the top where I saw them. So the question was really about the types of gifts in Japan. When you mentioned the appropriate gifts, the Detroit Tigers hats, although, you know, maybe Milwaukee Brewers hats would be good too. What were those? What would you see as appropriate gifts when you're giving it in that Japanese context? And of course, you're working in China, so as well, what kinds of things have you done or do you recommend? David.
Well, I would say it's anything that has a story of significance behind it or something that they definitely like. So getting to know the person and something about them is really helpful. And I would say that would be the rule. That's the rule of thumb that I use. Just make it significant. And then when you give it, there's also usually you explain why you're giving it. And so they enjoy it more. You know, so I just say get to know them so you can give a gift that's relevant to their personality.
Great, that good comment. And I know in the government, most of our meetings we've got, looks like my camera's frozen up, that most of our visits have a visiting gift. And so, yeah, oftentimes it's those things that have some cultural significance, things that are maybe a little bit unusual. It's not really so much about the value of the gift. It's more about the significance and the story behind it. Dream catchers, for example, that talk about Native American culture and what they do. So, and just as a sound check, are people able to hear me or have we lost sound?
We can hear you, Mark.
Oh, good. And my camera went black, so I don't know.
You're coming through loud and clear.
Blessing not be able to see me on screen. So there was a point made, a session, you know, when we're talking about Americans, America, that of course Americas go from Canada all the way down to, you know, Tierra del Fuego in South America. So you know, nearly it's a hemisphere. So when we're talking U.S., it's U.S. Americans in this case, because obviously our culture is a bit different than certainly if we're talking about Mexico or Canada even. I think you're maybe muted, Jessica.
I was, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to, here we go, the difference between British and American English or US. When people in Britain, I've lived in Britain for a long time. Even though I divide my time, I think I've become a bit more British. And when people say America here, they're referring to the United States. In fact, the Hofstede model has a Canada and every South American country in it. So there's a list of many, many, many countries, and Canada is one of them. So for my Canadian friends out there, I just wanted to make that distinction.
Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate that. And of course, with the flag, it kind of helps you to see that. But so from the chat, another one of the comments, which, and by the way, the question on the gifts was coming from Matt. And JP talking about from CW about resources, books, publications that could help provide, without having to read, volumes and volumes of things. What are some of those that information that can get you at least introduced to it? So certainly from CW, the Culture Map book, Erin, forgetting her last name, with INSEAD, great book. Also, Intercultural Press has a number of titles, doing business in, working with folks from China, folks from India. There's actually one working with Americans, which is kind of interesting to see what other people are saying about us. And then, of course, Hofstede Insights, and that website. And I go to that to compare countries, especially if I've not been to a place before, or just to refresh my memory about that and see what those dimensions are, and then what those scores are. But Jessica, and among I know there are quite a few books that the Hofstede has put out, just of the titles, let's say, that gives the most background and awareness, maybe in one book for folks who are just jumping into this. And Jessica, you're on mute.
Yeah. So I have all kinds of books I can recommend. In fact, I have them right here. There's Cultures and Organizations. It's a pretty thick book, but it's the Hofstede sort of go-to book. If you read it in bits, it's great because it explains in detail all the concepts that I raised and the other dimensions. There's Craig Storty. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He's written a book called Americans at Work. It's great reading about ourselves. Old World, New World, which is Germany, France, and the US, and Britain, which is quite interesting. That's by Craig Storty as well. Richard Lewis and all his writings. I think that's probably all I can think of off the top of my head.
Great, thanks. And actually, Intercultural Press is who does the Craig Storty books. I've got several of those, and they are great for, especially if you're looking at a particular region.
Yep.
Or place. So I'm still having an argument with my camera here, but so next question, actually, Jessica, to you from Matt. Your chart on adapting from low UAI to high uncertainty avoidance. What do you mean by accepting emotional reactions? Do we accept in the sense of solving the causes of their response, or simply allow the response without necessarily dealing with it?
Well, that, to me, there's a two-part answer. One is to not be surprised by it. It's not that it necessarily will happen, but it can happen. And before I was more educated on cultural differences and UAI, and that emotional reactions might happen, I was actually surprised and a few times offended by some people's behavior. You kind of have to deal with the root cause. So one situation, it was two different cultures, and they got into an argument, and I was facilitating the meeting. I had to get involved to find out what was going on, and we had to kind of do a timeout and, okay, let's just pull this apart. If there is an emotional reaction, something's very definitely wrong. And in a business context, yeah, I think we have to figure out what's going on and what's driving it. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. That's my simple answer to the question. There's a lot more, but that's what I would say.
Can I make a comment here, Mark?
Sure.
Yeah, so my experience with something similar to this, with working with a couple different Chinese companies, is there's a common thing that I refer to as the rant. And the rant is when the owner or the production manager or somebody in charge wants to vent. And what I found that really works well in that environment, in China specifically, is just to listen. They don't want you to respond. They don't want you to answer right there. They just want to express whatever the problem is or problems. And the way that I deal with that, the rant situation, which they're very emotional, is just to listen, to sort of take a very relaxed, subordinate type body posture, and then watch them carefully in terms of let them know that I'm actually listening to them very carefully. So when they look at me, that I'm making eye contact with them and watching. So versus an American manager, maybe that's upset where they're expecting you to answer. I think the Chinese one, in my experience, is that they don't want an answer. They just want to be heard, and that's the end of it. And so then you just sort of walk away, or you take that information and you apply it later, but they don't want a response. So that's just my experience in that.
Thank you. This is Maria. I'm jumping in. Mark shot a note saying that his audio has gone out. So here is a question that I'll pose to our presenters. If you're dealing with people coming from multiple countries to a joint meeting here in Wisconsin, is it best to stick with headquarters US culture, or is there some middle ground suggestion?
I guess I'll start. I'm pretty sure. Oh, go ahead. You go ahead, David. Go ahead.
Sure. So I work with our Spanish group, American group, and then China group quite a bit. And the funny part about this is that, to answer the question directly, I found that you have to honor whatever their cultural background is in terms of how they want the information. It's not the US. You can't just go from one perspective. For example, the Spanish people hate to be told what to do. The American people want to empower everyone, and the Japanese people want to be told what to do, or Chinese. So to answer that question, I would say that to understand, listening to what Jessica said in terms of understanding where the different countries lie in the bar has been so helpful for me. It's so key, because when you just approach it from the American point of view, there's always miscommunications, as a former director in our business just would run into roadblocks. So you have to honor each country's custom approach, cultural approach. Sorry.
I agree. I mean, doing a little bit of reading, there's so much information out there, but at least understanding who's in the room. And, on the other hand, you're not going to be able to please everybody, but I think being polite and recognizing that there could be issues, and and paying attention while you're in a meeting or giving a presentation or whatever, and seeing what people's body language is doing or expressions on their face, and and soliciting their input, perhaps one-on-one or something like that. I think that's pretty much all I have to add to that. I think Mark's answer is really good.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I've missed a lot of what I can see on screen is great conversation, but actually couldn't speak because very conveniently audio went completely out just as we're doing this. So forgive me if this question's already been asked that came through from Stanley Frang.
Mark, yeah, that's the one we just.
Oh, you did?
Sure, feedback. Yep.
Excellent. And then there was a comment from Sasha in the U.S. Given our obsession with confidence and individualist basis, we don't emphasize listening and communication tool. As a communication tool, I've got some maybe comment around that. Oops.
I'm thinking.
Oh, okay. And everybody, we can have cameras on if you like this.
Yeah, I think, I think it is, I think what we both said in the last, answering the last question is, we really do need to pay attention, and we do need to observe and listen. You can, you can gain a lot by, saying less and hearing more. I don't know what else to say to that. It works for me. I mean, I deal with other cultures every day of the week, and it's it really, and I love to talk. But I really do need to use these. It's sort of the 80-20 rule. Sometimes it's more listening so that you say the right thing. But the
Sure.
research
Yeah,
and
thanks.
understanding who you're with makes a big difference.
Great. Well, thanks, Jessica. And I know we're getting close to our 1:45 time, I think, as we're getting close to wrap up. Elena, I see you have your camera on. Were you looking to talk, or just showing your nice self to us all? So I appreciate that. And yeah, I should have mentioned before, when we get to conversation, if you've got a camera and if it works, then to turn it on, and we can have a somewhat in-person conversation, at least virtually here.
I thought I heard you say
so-
something about it, Mark. That's all.
Mark, I have a question. This is Maria.
Sure.
As David had mentioned and Jessica sort of reiterated, getting to know people, having that face-to-face time is so important. How do you feel your relationships are at this point, given the last 2 years? Things have all been virtual. Do you feel like they've taken a step back? How do you envision kind of getting back to where you were pre-COVID?
I guess I'll go first. Luckily, the companies that I've been working with, prior to COVID, I spent a lot of time getting to know everybody. So there's a lot of travel overseas and them visiting us as well in America. So we had already established, I would say, not just a business relationship, but an interpersonal one. I knew if their kids had broken legs or if they were missing school, things like that, which is really helpful. So, and throughout COVID and this entire time, we've been having regular meetings, and even the weekly meetings. I'm a real big fan of meeting either every week or every quarter, some interval that's regular, that makes sense for the project. Because some projects I meet every week, some projects it's once a quarter. But it's that sort of consistency with the relationship that I think is what keeps it going, so that we understand how we communicate is the key thing, so that when problems do come up, we've already got our communication circle in place, where I understand if James is angry or if Tiffany's angry or something like that, if they're really serious, so that constantly practicing just communicating. Even though we have our weekly meeting, sometimes there's not really any topics to cover. We just meet for maybe 15 minutes. We're establishing or verifying that relationship, reaffirming it, I guess. And then when the problems do come up, we can just continually, we can get through them even quicker, because we're not worried about offending, or we're not worried about being stabbed in the back by each other, because we're all friends and we understand how to listen to each other. So it's, I would say in my case, it's just as good as it was, but I can't wait to get back over there or have them come visit too. So it's always fun.
I'll just add a couple of comments. The relationships I had, it kind of echoes what David just said. The relationships that I had prior to COVID, it's not such a big deal. The relationships of the Chinese group that I'm helping to manage, that started right at COVID. So that really has required a lot more regular communication. Video is a must. I mean, we have to at least be able to see each other. I think though, in my industry, my core industry, which is language services, we're used to not seeing each other. So we've adapted to this kind of platform a long time ago. So that's why I had to buy some time to think about it, because I can't fly to 35 countries to see all my clients. I'd like to, but I couldn't do it even pre-COVID. So it does create some some distance, but I think the frequency and, again, it's really trying to pay attention to what's going on. And if you aren't sure, confirming, asking, and that sort of thing to make sure that the understanding is there.
Excellent. The one thought I had is you were talking, Jessica, through the different culture, national cultures, thinking about, especially in the U.S., Canada, some of these locations where, and now that'll be happening in Poland, some other parts of the world, but the number of first-generation immigrants coming into the country, of course, their national cultures. But then, if you start thinking about second, third, fourth-generation immigrants, is the U.S., Canada, are we shifting a little bit in our scores, or is it more that as that second, third, fourth generation, they become much more assimilated and they actually come closer to what the U.S., let's say, scores are in terms of, is there much of a move in that national culture given the amount of immigration that may be happening?
As of the most recent validation of the Hofstede model, no. In terms of relation to other countries, I mean, America, see, I'm doing it again. The United States is really good at assimilating cultures. I think it will be very interesting to see if that holds true, because, some of the immigration is coming from very particular areas. And I have to say, spending so much time when I'm in the States, it's in Texas. You can't help but notice there is sort of almost a separate culture of the Hispanic population, but I don't think the research has kind of gotten into that level, not as far as I know anyway. But in general, again, this is the great thing about Hofstede, and it's also kind of that bell curve, and it's always looking at kind of the where the majority of people fit, and even today the majority of people fit within the general guidelines. And as I said earlier, they're going to be outliers, but in the main there are shifts for sure, but by and large countries tend to shift together. And if I read or find out anything different from that, I'll let you know.
Well, thanks. And, thinking about that recommendation of reading materials, and I know just from my past work, I've got a few things that may be a bit dated, but maybe between us, we can pull together a reading list and then make that available to the MITA members that are part of that, get another benefit of MITA membership. So we can maybe work on that, just so we've got a set of our favorite titles to be able to share with the folks as they're looking to go to different locations. So why don't we do that? Because I'm always looking for new and interesting stuff to read on those long flights that we perhaps will be taking once we go start meeting people in person again. So, well, we're about 10 minutes in, and from the MITA board folks, what's our, I know the invite is till 2 o'clock. Is our meeting running all the way to 2, or?
I would say if there's no more questions or feedback or input, we can give people back a couple minutes in their day and wrap things up early.
Sure. I see a clapping symbol there for someone who needs to get back on something else, Sasha. Well, here's the announcement we've been waiting for. So the Culture Compass, and board members and ex officio board members were not eligible for this. So Henrietta did the Wheel of Fortune names, whatever app to randomize the names, and those winners are, as I build the tension.
The suspense. Mark, the
To try to-
suspense.
to try to read the names because I'm missing the email. Here we go. Matt McCormick and James Wiley. So the two of you are the
Hey.
recipients of the Culture Compass. So congratulations. And it's, well, it's quoted in British pounds, but it's, I don't know, it's what, $50 or so US?
No, it's a little
I
less than
think.
that. Yeah, it's about, I would say about $35. Yeah.
35. Well,
Yeah,
with
roughly.
inflation, I don't know. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, it's but well worth, I think, more than that. It's an interesting insight in yourself, and what we'll do is we'll work with Henrietta and the folks on the board here to get you the voucher that then you can go to Hofstede Insights and check that out and kind of understand, within those national culture measures, where you might fit in with those and some other insights about yourself, which then helps you understand about how you interact with other folks. If there aren't any more comments or questions, I appreciate David and Jessica, the time that you've shared with us and the information, certainly. So that's great. And Carla, to Geo Group, thank you for your sponsorship of this important topic. And I think as you begin to really read and understand more of this, it helps give you not just the noticing the difference, the cultural awareness, but to really move you toward intercultural understanding. So that as you're doing these things, you understanding why you're doing them helps you integrate them more into what you do. So it really, to my mind, is an invaluable set of skills that if you're doing international business and frankly even home business, and I know, or within the U.S. domestic, and I know Hofstede Insights also does work around corporate cultures as well. So not just assessing national cultures, but culture within your organization, and especially for those companies who have operations overseas, to understand the national cultures, but also what about my corporate culture and how does that fit in with, especially if you've got an acquisition overseas, how does that corporate culture fit in, A, the national culture, B, how do you integrate the corporate cultures? So it's another whole area that obviously we don't have time for today and outside of our scope, but I think are important skill sets and information to have as you're trying to be successful in your businesses. So
One final note, Mark. Well, one final note. We will put the recording up on the resources section of InfoHub. So if you're a MITA member, you can go back and look at the presentation materials and recording. And a final thank you to Anna Garage for all her help in getting this meeting set up and organized.
Yeah, and
thanks to you, Mark, for all your work.
No, glad to do it. And Henrietta, certainly for the Wheel of Name Fortune name wheel thing. I appreciate everybody's time and the opportunity to share this information. So I think with that, we've got yet 5 more minutes to go crazy.
All right. Well, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Jessica.
you so much.
Jessica, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Jessica.